Great. Okay. Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome. I'm really excited to be doing this now for the second year, a collaboration between the Start With Children Summit and CAMP. So thank you very much to CAMP for the invitation. This year, we have a theme. For those of you who know the summit, last year it was more of a kind of general approach to child-friendly planning, which was very much about public space and sort of ends up being a lot about the street. And this year, we are focused more on housing and neighborhood design and what impact that has on childhoods. Luckily for us, we have Dinah Bornat in the world, who also has been doing a lot of research about housing in particular, mainly in the UK, but not only, and has produced a book, has written a book about what children need from housing design, which is what we're going to cover tonight, mainly. I'm going to open up with just a little bit of a kind of overview of child-friendly planning as a field, as an approach, and then we will go into Dinah's presentation and then leave plenty of time for discussion. So, my name is Simon Battisti. Again, I'm the creative director of the Start With Children Summit, and I have a practice based in Tirana, Albania, for the past 10 years. I run an NGO there, and we do mainly a school streets program with the city of Tirana. And so we've been thinking about childhood and the city, and really it all quite started with trying to get an understanding of what kids and parents need from the city. And one of the very first things that we did in Tirana back in 2018 was we gave a survey to the parents of preschoolers, and we said we wanted to know about their relationship to the street and to public space and how they used it. And we asked them two questions. We said, what kind of space is closest to your home, and what kind of space for play is closest to your home, and what kind of space for play would you prefer for your child to use? So the answers were interesting. When we asked them, what kind of space do you prefer for your child to play, of course, everybody said public park, playground. It's sort of what you would expect, a kind of safe, big green space. When we asked them, where do they actually play, they said the street. But only 2%, so only 2% are close to a public park, while 62% play in front of the street. And you've got this mismatch where, in so many cities now, we understand that the street is just not a very good place for kids to be. Most parents don't want their kid playing in the street. And when we think about what kind of city we want to make for kids and what kind of city we want to make for childhood, we understand that the street is very important. And essentially, if we were going to define how that works, we want the street to be the best place to play. And in many ways, that is a kind of basic explanation of what a child-friendly planning practice is kind of all about. Now, another experience that we had in Tirana that was very interesting was we were doing a kind of pop-up school street one day, and a mother from a house very nearby was hanging out there a lot. And we asked her at some point, what do you like about this space? How does it work for you? And because there's a very decent green space about a 5-minute walk from here, why don't you go there? And she said, that's too far. 5-minute walk is too far for me with my baby and my 3-year-old. I've got lunch is cooking on the stove. I've got to clean the house. I've got all of these responsibilities. And a 5-minute walk is just too long, and so I can't make it. And so this space for her, right outside of her front door, was perfect. She doesn't need much. You can see that this space is essentially made with heavy concrete blocks to kind of block the traffic and a little bit of essentially chalk on the ground. It's extremely inexpensive, But really what it's doing is just kind of carving out a little bit of space for her to have a 15-minute period of time spent outside. It's enough time for her 3-year-old to kind of get some energy out and to just stand there with her baby. So the kinds of spaces that we need to design into our cities are actually extremely simple. They don't really require much, but everybody needs that space right out in front of their front door. And so this is something that we're going to hear a lot about today in the research that Dinah has been doing about the importance of doorstep play, the importance of having just a little bit of good enough space right outside the front door goes a really, really long way. Okay, so start with children. We think about Start with Children as the name itself as a kind of important phrase. And when we think back through planning history, there's a couple of instances where planners and people city makers really did start with children. And one of those was in the 1970s in the Netherlands. This is a moment where there was a lot of car ownership was skyrocketing. Typically, kids would play right outside of their front door, but because of all of the influx of those cars into cities, kids were getting hit by cars all the time. There was a lot of collisions, and kids were getting killed. And there was a massive outrage, obviously, and parents and community groups came together, and they said, we need to shape our streets from the perspective of what our kids need. And that was a really radical shift. That was a very important moment where we said, let's think about the city from a different perspective. And in many ways, you can say that they sort of started with children in their understanding of how to design that space, and they ended up designing what's essentially what the Woonurf, or the Dutch shared street, came out of this movement, where they said, what do our kids need from the public realm? Our kids need a slow street, a slow space, where cars are not dominant, where kids' needs are prioritized. And this model has essentially now become quite a kind of standard way to approach neighborhood streets in the Netherlands. This year, the headliner of the conference is Carlos Moreno. And all of you, I assume, know about the 15-minute city concept that's been sort of rolled out in Paris and now many other cities around the world that tries to think about proximity, and especially coming from the needs of caregivers and people living at home, the idea that they need to be able to access their daily needs within a 15-minute walk in the case of Paris. But in conversation with Carlos, we have come to understand that the 15-minute city concept also started with children. Carlos was working with Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, on a school streets program and a green schoolyards program about 10 years ago. And through that conversation, thinking about what do kids need from the city, what are kids' needs in terms of mobility and in terms of play space, they ended up coming up with a thing that is now called the 15-minute city concept. So again, another really important sort of urban concept that is much in need of refinement and of course needs to be applied in each city in its own way. But this idea of proximity and what people need from the city, again, started with children. And I think in terms of how the conference that we are creating is trying to give some shape to a child-friendly planning field, I think it's really instructive to kind of understand these models and go back to them. So just 2 examples now, and then I'll pass it over to Dinah. 2 other sessions that are happening this year. Angela Garbus is an American author, and she will be in conversation with Johnny Anstead. Angela wrote a book in 2022 called Essential Labor, Mothering a Social Change, and it really is a kind of description of her experience as a mother in the American urban context where she just felt alone all the time. She just felt like she did not have the kind of support, the kind of community around her that she needed to raise her kids. And in a particular chapter, she writes a lot about her memories. Her parents were from the Philippines, and when she was a kid, she would go back to the Philippines and kind of understand this big net of community that were able to sort of contribute to the labor of raising children. And drawing on that memory during COVID, sitting around saying, man, this city and this neighborhood that I live in just don't work for me and my needs. Meanwhile, Johnny Anstead is the principal of Town, which is a house builder, a developer in the UK, which is responsible for Marmalade Lane, among many other intergenerational co-housing developments, which approach this question and say, actually, a lot of people are in your shoes, a lot of people are in the same boat, and we as a company want to produce housing that sort of answers that need. And when you talk to people in Marmalade Lane, they describe their experience of living in intergenerational co-housing scenario as living in a kind of village. And so they will be in conversation, sort of talking about what one person needs and what another company has sort of started to kind of come up with. Okay. Here we are with Dinah. Again, Dinah, thank you so much for being with us. We had the chance to be in Bratislava yesterday and do a workshop with a group of young people that we will then also be able to, we will hear from those young people about what they need from housing and neighborhoods at the conference. And tonight we're going to hear about Dinah's book, about some case studies, about what we do know works well for children, and then we'll have a conversation about it. So, Dinah, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Thank you for having me in Prague. This is my first time in Prague, and it's a beautiful, beautiful day to arrive. I think you'll agree. So this is a book. This is my book, which was published a couple of months ago, so it's very fresh, but it's got a life of its own now, which is lovely. So this is a picture of my son a few years ago, and he is playing out on our street. And I live a little bit like one of the previous slide. You remember the previous slide, which was from the 1970s. But it's not the 1970s anymore, and our street is lined with cars. And when they were younger, the kids never could play out, but a really clever few women in Bristol came together and decided that they had an idea about how we could start to close the street for traffic. And it kind of caught on in the UK and is now quite global, actually. And it's called Playing Out. And it's a model for closing the road so that cars can't drive down, so that kids can have some space and time to play outside. So the kids are here. We live fairly near a park, but they're having a time of their lives just playing out on the street. And we did lots of these street sessions when my daughters are a bit older, but when they were younger. And I started thinking about it as I'm an architect, and I started wondering whether this was an urban planning issue that we needed to know more about. And I kind of naively approached my local authority in East London, which is called Hackney, and we'd started the Playing Out sessions, and they were really supportive. They were like setting up a group within the borough. There was a little bit of funding so that we could get the equipment we needed to close the road, which is not much. And I said to them, you know, everyone's talking about the fact that kids don't play out anymore, but there seem to be places where they are playing out, like some of the housing estates in Hackney, like this one. And I said, do you have any statistics on where children play out? And they kind of went, no. So I thought to myself, well, we kind of need to know. Maybe there's something about the layout of housing that kind of enables children to be able to play like this, even in the car park here in this housing estate. Maybe it's something about, this is like a 6-story block with what we call deck access. So you've got routes to the homes on the upper floors and front doors facing that space. Maybe there's something about that spatial layout that is kind of supporting those kids to play. So I set about trying to find out how and why. and to try and think about whether we could come up with some kind of a mapping system, a way of systematizing what we are looking for, which is kind of essentially spaces where children can enjoy that kind of freedom. That makes a lot of sense. I'm not going to kind of sort of do a whole kind of history of why it's really important that children spend lots of time playing outside. But I will say that exactly what Simon just said, if they can play outside their homes, they can do so for hours and hours while their parents get up to other things. And if the relationship between the home and that space works in the right way, then it just happens really naturally. So the first thing that we did was, I was teaching at the time on the master's program at the University of East London. So I had at my disposal 15 students who could go out and do some work, and observational work, and just find out whether there were different levels of play and social use on a number of housing estates across the borough that I lived in Hackney. So we took some 20th century schemes, and they stood and people counted for hours on end, and we started to map the spaces and give them and color code them. And this was a kind of early map, and we had a presentation, and we brought in the lead member for housing in the borough, lucky chance number one. He quite quickly became the mayor, and he was really interested in housing. He was really interested in the kind of nerdy stuff that architects are interested in, like deck access and so on. So like we were having conversations about the things that kind of mattered. So following on from this piece of work, we got more funding to do more research, and the journals became really interested, because suddenly we were on to something that was kind of analysing and looking at the housing that was being built now. So obviously it was really interesting to study some 20th century housing estates, but actually we don't build like we did in the 20th century anymore for lots of reasons. So we needed to start looking at some of the newer schemes, and this is a scheme in east of London, sort of in the kind of suburban area that's now much denser as the next phases are being delivered. This is Barking Riverside, and what we saw was this. There were lots of children playing out. There was lots of spaces where the homes were really closely related to the shared spaces, and it was working really well. So just to explain what we did, it's actually quite easy to do this kind of people counting, just takes a long time. So by the time we started getting some funding together, we were able to employ researchers and have them standing for hours and hours on end. And the way we did it was we followed Jan Gehl, the Danish urbanist and architect, principles of counting people in space. And so you're not talking to anybody, you're just watching what they're doing. And his ideas were based on more to do with kind of city centre living, and this idea of like necessary movement and optional movement, kind of social use of space. And so we kind of took that on. So there's lots of different types of activities to do with being like moving through the space, but also stopping and chatting to your neighbours and playing and supervising play. And at the time, we then realised, after we'd by this point done hundreds of hours of observation, that we hadn't really started talking to children as well about it. So it kind of became the sort of the triangle really of like observing, mapping and talking. And it felt very much like we were going to have to really bring in the talking and bring those three things together, because they all kind of hold together well. So we set a challenge to the mayor of Hackney. We presented all our work in front of him at a conference. And he did an interesting thing, actually. He came along. I don't know if you ever go to conferences where politicians rock up. They usually come in the morning and they're looking at their watches quite a lot. And they run off, don't they, after about half an hour and tell us exactly what it is we already knew we were doing, and then leave. But he came at the end of the day. And as he came in, we had a mixture of lots of professionals in the room from kind of all different walks within the sector and beyond. And they'd gone on a kind of tour around the area and been asked to think about it through the sort of the eyes of a child. And they all came back quite excited and said, "This is the most interesting conference we've ever been to." And he kind of got the vibe. And I turned to him on the stage and said, "Okay, so do you think we could make the borough child-friendly by 2026?" This was 2016. And he went, yeah. Okay. I didn't expect him to say that. So they set out on to do a planning document that's a Hackney child-friendly borough planning document. But meanwhile, we asked him if there's an estate that we could look at in more detail, because we want to go for higher density and mapping on those estates. Which one is it? Can we have your blessing? And he told us to look at the de Beauvoir estate in Hackney, again, still very localised. So we started to map this estate. That's where you saw that last slide. And we started to colour code it according to 4 principles that we thought were the real principles that were supporting the use of space by children. And these 4 principles are shown here. It's whether the space is overlooked, whether it's car-free, whether it's directly accessible from homes, and whether it's connected to another space. So on this estate, all the whites are buildings, and all the colour is any available space that you can get to. So it could be a car park, it could be a road. And the grey is private space, so back gardens and stuff. So this is what we call in the UK a mixed development. It's got towers and slab blocks and maisonettes. Maisonettes at the homes. So it's like low-rise, mid-rise, and not high, but kind of 10-storey towers. And so you can see really different colours here. And what's really interesting is that when we people counted on 5 of those spaces, we saw the red space here is the most well used, the most well loved by the children on the estate. This orange space here, which is a playground that's got better equipment than this one, is less well used. It's really difficult to get into, really difficult to walk through. Children avoid going that way for lots of very small connecting reasons. And then this space here by the canal, that's actually kind of lovely green space, but it's mostly used by dog walkers. So if you look at this gradient here, the top scoring colour is 8. So that's 2 from here, 2 from here, 2 from here, and 2 from here. So it gets all 8 points. And then the lower scoring light blues is getting about a 1. So we started talking to the children about the spaces they use, and it was correlating with the mapping. So we realised we were onto something. And we felt like we developed a mapping system, and from now on we just need to test whether we're right. So we've been doing that for the last 9 years. And these are the 4 principles that again and again just come up as being really critical. Now you recognise being car-free, but remember that first slide where the kids were playing in the car park? You can score 0, 1 or 2. So a car park is a 1 because actually it's not car-free, but it's kind of not got cars driving through it. If it's overlooked, you can get greater degrees of overlooking. So it might have a balcony or a deck access, so that facade is more well activated. But really important, is it, the last 2 I think, is it directly accessible from a home? Do you need to cross a street to get there? Because that's the biggest barrier. And then is it forming a connection of other to other spaces? So that's another really important thing. So these 4 things in place, they're really simple spatial elements. And if you take a resident, a child, you can start to talk about these words. They're really clear in that space. And they'll tell you where the drug users are, because those 4 things won't be in place. They'll tell you where all the kids play out in the summer. They'll tell you, and you'll explain to them that it's quite simple. This is when it works. And so this is something I'll come to in the book. But essentially, at this point in our work, we were really interested in building out schemes that kind of follow those principles. And so these are a couple of schemes that never got off the drawing board. One was for a competition entry, all about the home of the future, and another one is a development site with that same developer, actually, Town, where we were looking at a child-friendly layout for the site. But we did do one scheme quite quickly afterwards, based on these principles, when one of the developers who came to the conference that we gave realised that this was something that he could kind of work with. We had a system, and that system was going to make sense. The idea that this development was going to work for the community was really attractive to him. So we designed a scheme of 19 affordable homes. So this is for social rent, and they're all the same size. They're all 2-bedroom homes, and that's a good size for a young family. And they're all arranged, nearly all of them, around a garden. And that's the relationship between the home and the garden is really critical in Section. there's someone cooking the dinner. They can see the street, but they can also see out into the courtyard and across into that shared garden. And the height of that fence, really important, 1,300 mil, because it's the eye line of a 6-year-old child or somebody seated. But there's a privacy screen here. So you've got a private courtyard, shared garden, L-shaped home, and then you've got tucked underneath, you've got your car parking in a carport. So this is kind of an unusual L-shaped layout, but the planners were very happy with it because it protects the homes and the garden from the noise of the nearby motorway. So a kind of like greenfield, brownfield site on the edge of a town is kind of low density development that you could see across the UK with the desire to build 1.5 million homes. This is the result. So this family here with these 2 boys, when we spoke to the mum about what her life was like, she said, it's just completely changed since I moved from the street where they had the park across the road. And the kids wanted to go and play there all the time, but just like your mum that you talked about, I couldn't get out there all the time, but it's fine. As soon as I come home, I'm writing emails, I'm cooking the dinner, I'm tidying up the house. They're just outside all the time, after school, at the weekends. I can't bring them in. It doesn't matter what the weather's like. And these kids are just happy. I mean, I have said to the Housing Association they could do with a bit more equipment out there. But they bring out the plastic and the bikes, and it's got even more full now as the kids around them are getting older and clearly playing in there all the time. So that scheme is called Sydney Close, and it's one of the case studies in the book. And the book is available to buy, and I think also to download. You can get an e-copy of it. It's divided into 4 chapters. The first chapter, you showed a photograph of, is the kind of this idea that the street space was the space where children were playing. I mean, you showed that photograph from Amsterdam, and I guess a slightly different city, maybe at the time, but this city street here, it's got 1 car on it, and the kids are using that space. It's not green, and it's quite good for wheels, but they're right outside their front door, just playing outside. This is what our generation and others really feel like we've lost. So it's about how can we recreate that proximity and that relationship when we know that the street has gone for the car. And those of us who are architects, this is a kind of like constant battle, isn't it, about how we can reclaim this space, because the 1 car, tiny car, at the end of the street is not one anymore. So the first chapter really looks back at the kind of the sort of principles and the policies in the UK after the war, but I'm sure it will chime with lots of things that were happening across Europe, lots of ideas for kind of large-scale mass housing in that time, kind of moving through sort of systems-built construction, but really thinking at the time about relationships between the kind of growing car ownership and actually pedestrians and children. And there were many estates, and I'm sure there were housing schemes built here as well, which were actually prioritising the needs of the child. And this is a really lovely example by a Hungarian architect who moved to the UK called Peter Tarbury, who worked for Camden Architects, and he designed this scheme in Highgate in North London, where the idea was that kids could walk home from school. And one of the reasons why it works, if you can see this section, is it's built into a hill here, but the cars are underneath and the people are on top. And it's actually a really interesting section and relationship of like stacked maisonettes, and really this statement here by one of the residents who isn't an architect, but funnily enough the estate is lived in by quite a lot of architects, describes that kind of spatial relationship between inside and outside, the circulation space, that chance encounter with your neighbour, and the relationship that you have with the people who are next door to you and the people walking past. This phrase, aren't we lucky? What a nice idea about the place that you live. And then I've brought a friend of mine here with me called Jennifer, who's really familiar with this estate because her kids grew up on this estate, right? And this is a different kind of layout, similarly kind of what we would call quite low density now, but deliberately so in London at the time. Towards the tail end of that, this is in the 1970s, like like that previous scheme, but it's a different kind of layout. But here the kids are playing outside their homes in ways where, again, there's not much equipment here, but they're using the landscape, and they're using it not with the wheels, but this is all green. And when you look at this estate, what we've done here is we've used that heat map to show what those spaces are like. So, Jennifer, you're going to have to hopefully agree with me on this. There are actually 4 kind of open spaces on the estate. And funnily enough, I mean, this is quite close to where I live, but this is one of them. But nobody ever uses this space, right, by the road. This space is green, but it's kind of between some car parking spaces, and that's the main road. And like, fine, but it's like, these are the spaces where everybody uses. And this is a kind of connection between them. And so when you start to map everything out, you get like a really warm estate. I've only got really good examples in the book, but there's lots of examples if you wanted to map yourself of very cold spaces. This is actually a really popular big park, which is kind of on the doorstep, but not what I would call the doorstep. And actually, when you talk to people who live here, the kids will play out in this estate, and not until they get a bit older will they get as far as the park. So the park's there, but the park, even just around the corner, isn't that quite on the doorstep. Anyway, simple section. We haven't got any cars here, but they're kind of kept at the edges. They do come into the estate, but there's enough connection between these spaces for it to work quite well. Chapter 3 really thinks about how do we bring that conversation in with young people? What do we set? What are the conversations we're having? How do we get them to explain to us how they're using space? And actually, we use quite a specific kind of system, which again I've borrowed from some other researchers who are really really hot on kind of play. And this idea that a space can feel green or amber or red, like a traffic light. When green is a space where you feel like you can play, do what you want, hang out, which is what the phrase you might want to use when you're a little bit older. Amber is a space that might be a bit more supported, and then in what you do, and then red is a space that's quite restricted. And they're really quick to understand that as a concept, and you can then translate that back to the kind of mapping that I showed. Really interestingly, going to Bratislava yesterday and talking to some of the young people there, it chimed with some work that I'd seen in Sweden, in Malmö, where they have a similar kind of layout of what they call the Million Homes program, kind of low-income, mid-rise housing, not kind of fully courtyard blocks, but like quite permeable, sort of edge of Malmö development. But actually, when they were thinking about where to put the infill blocks, the young people were telling them that they didn't want to lose that freedom and that mobility that they had, that had kind of been inherently built in and improved recently. So it's made them really think again about how to densify and intensify that that part of the city. And I think that, for me, that's what's really interesting. So the phrase "start with children" is about before you even think about a new development or an existing development that you're going to increase the housing on, start by thinking about children. Quite often you might find, and I find when architects presenting a scheme, and I do lots of design reviews in London, in the outer boroughs and across the capital, that you'll hear about the pedestrian movement and the cycling and the buses and the trains and the trams and you'll have got to the cars and you'll think, what about the kids? And further down the presentation, someone will show you where the play space is. And I'm like, start with the children. Start with telling us how they move through the space, because they'll be going in a different direction to school. They'll be going across the city rather than in. And they're going to be using space at home after school in a completely different way. If you start thinking about that and you lay out the development to work for them, you're going to be on the right foot for the rest of your scheme. It's not everybody. I don't actually agree with the phrase that a city designed for children works for everyone, because I think we have to be thinking in much more nuanced and intersectional ways. But I do think that if you start by thinking about it, you're following a group of people that are not in the room. So the last 2 chapters of the book really focus on how can we analyze the familiar typology of the perimeter block. So I look at it from a kind of lower density perspective, and I mean like anywhere between 40 and, let's say, 70 dwellings per hectare. Our main volume house builders in the UK are kind of embarrassingly low densities of like 30 plus 40, when they could be building a lot better, a lot more efficiently on their sites, and certainly providing the space for children to play as well. So there's a kind of analysis of a typical house builder scheme and showing how kind of poor quality is across the board in terms of its site usage, but also how there is literally no space for children to play. And so this kind of community being held together can't occur. Marmalade Lane is one of the schemes. All the case studies in the book talks to adults, actually, about what their experience is like, mostly with children growing up on the estate. So Marmalade Lane, luckily, I'm lucky enough to know a family who live there. And so I got a really good conversation with what it's like. This is a street which is kind of the front. It's actually a fronts to back street, which surprises a lot of architects, because that's one of the kind of typologies that we don't like to design in. But that on the left hand side of this photograph, those are actually the backs, and then on the right hand side are the fronts. And this is this kind of play street where the kids are out with their wheels, and then at the back of where you had the fronts, this is the garden, and these low walls where the separation between the private and the public space is kind of clear, but inviting and kind of mitigated in a way that works really well from a co-housing perspective. Maybe a little bit too communal for some people, but it's a kind of similar game that we were playing at Sydney Close, where you really think about those boundaries. So that's the heat map. So that's the garden at the back and the street at the front. And these are the kind of developments around it, where you've got much cooler spaces. I like this phrase. This is my friend Hannah. She's got 4 kids, so this has been an absolute blessing for her to move here. And then in Holland, where we start to think about, I'm just going to go back if I can, just to show you here. The cars are, oops, that's the wrong thing. The cars are at the edge, and that's quite common, I think, with co-housing. They're quite comfortable with moving the cars to the edge and reducing the amount of parking. At this scheme in Utrecht, in Veermarkt, called Veermarkt, is the cars are underneath, and that's obviously expensive, but that's the decision that they've made here. And this is a development where you could choose your own kind of house and design it with an architect to some kind of principles. I think that Holland's got a few of these kind of cute varied schemes, but what I'm interested in is the kind of not the architecture so much, but the style rather, but the relationship between the homes. So this is the courtyard space that they have here, and actually some of the sort of built-up bits are because it's on top of a car park. As I spoke to somebody here, I don't know anyone who lives here, but I was posting letters through the door, and a guy came out and said, "I want to talk to you about what it's like to live here." And he talked about, you can see all the gardens at the back. They've got quite a lot of private space, but this is that garden that kid was playing in, and you can see here how they're sort of buried under the cars underneath, and cars on the street. And then we move to the higher density development. So anything from, which I would, in the UK is low actually, 90 dwellings per hectare, up to about 200. We are going a lot higher than that in the UK, but this is probably a good example for you, like 6, 7 stories with sometimes a few kind of mixture of towers. So actually, to begin with, I went to look at Barcelona, the famous superblocks. I was interested in how they dealt with the courtyards, and I think it's a lesson that's maybe very particular to the Eixample, where the superblocks have been kind of tested out, because also they have created these courtyards by taking them back from private ownership. And that's been actually quite hard work, and I think there's been a shift away from this kind of reclaiming of the courtyards. And what's interesting, if you have a look on this photograph, is you can see that actually the homes are kind of like up above. If you want to get into this courtyard space, you come round and then in through an entrance, and you can see on the heat maps where that courtyard is here. So to get to it, you have to come out of your block and then go around. So these are actually, I think interestingly, kind of not as successful as some of the ones that you get in other cities, because they're not quite as connected to the housing because of the way this part of the Barcelona was laid out. But interesting how you can kind of heat map the spaces in between and how they become a kind of a small but a kind of connected spaces. I mean, if you want to get really kind of into the way that they use the traffic moves through the Eixample, it does still come in, but it's quite controlled down these yellow routes here. It's kind of a nice little kind of geometric thing they're doing. But then moving on to more recent schemes, and this is a nice example of a scheme in the Amsterdam School, kind of part of Amsterdam, and this is again homes around a garden and entrances at inside the courtyard, and the cars underneath again. So quite simple layout, but kind of 90 dwellings per hectare, so quite low. There are different tricks that you can use in Denmark. Quite often you might see kind of raised ground floors, so it's quite nice having that sort of your stoop, your front door here, where you've got a bit more privacy, looking out over this space. It's trickier to do this in the UK because we have quite stringent accessibility rules. But I think you can kind of get away with it if you get away with it's not the right phrase, but if you can kind of enter around the back into these courtyards here. These are actually two different schemes, but you know, quite often you've got these nice spacious courtyards and they're all open to the street. There's no gates or fences, and everyone comes home this way. They're quite relaxed about where they leave their bikes, as in not so much in London where we're always putting them inside and worried about them being stolen. They seem to be quite happy about kind of locking them up outside, and then there's lots of kind of other things you can do inside the courtyard, and they're very activated, so that the 4 principles that we talked about, you remind me to remember what they are. They're all really heavily in place here, so like really connected, really directly accessible, really well overlooked, and obviously car-free. So this space works really well. And then also this street is pretty good as well. So you've got a kind of interconnected spaces. We're kind of seeing those 4 principles coming up again and again. And then in another scheme in London, which is a scheme which is a combination of existing, which you can see at the back, blocks here, and new builds, sort of forming new courtyards. This very well-known play street here, which connects the main road with another part of another road further down, and then courtyards for children to play in again. You've got the same principles in place. You've got really good overlooking. You've got really good accessibility. All of those things are in place. And you can see the layout here. These are the existing blocks, and then these are forming the new courtyards, the slightly chunkier, newer bits, and then the existing blocks are all sort of overclad. And just what I like about this one actually is Kathy, who lives here, who's in her 70s, so she's not got kids, or they're grown up, and that she moved here recently. And she talks about the courtyard and how much pleasure it gives her to look at it. And actually this scheme is where you start to kind of tip between, the sorts of densities where you're getting a kind of enough space to play, but it starts to become complicated because you've got allotments and you've got ball games and you've got different users and movement, and you've really got to get your streets working as hard as your courtyards so that kids can get around easily, because you can't contain all the play in these courtyards. It's very, very tight. So whilst these are really warm spaces, there's a point at which you can't chuck any more homes on top of this block and expect there to be thousands of children enjoying that space in the way that our guidelines are requiring us to do, which is to provide 10 square meters per child. As soon as I've been saying to the planners in London, as soon as we tip over 200 dwellings per hectare, we can't do that. And then just to finish with, where this book and the research has led us is to kind of like develop toolkits for how to actually do good participation. So alongside the mapping, it's about how can we work with children and young people, and also advising the government on how we need to include them effectively in the planning system so that we can, you know, like you say, start with children. Thank you.
Thank you.
The iPad. So we're having a panel discussion now, right?
Yes. So I have a couple questions for you. And then I think that there's a microphone that can be passed around also to the audience in case anybody has a question. We're doing a live stream now, so please use the microphone and just don't shout out. So we came here on the train together today and had a chance to talk about the four principles.
Mm-hmm.
And so me being a person who's coming from kind of more of the streets world,
Mm-hmm.
Where we think about the safety of the street, and we think about all of our work is about changing the way that the street works. And you kind of made it sound like housing designers can just sort of ignore the street, and like they were in the 1970s. I think a lot of those housing designers were still saying, well, we have to take it for granted that the street is for moving big flows of vehicles, but we can kind of turn our back and make courtyards.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not so much the case today, I think. I think architects are kind of accepting that they have to also work on the street. But yeah, how do you think about cars and mobility and the street in the relationship to the house? Because it seems like architects and developers have a huge potential to be creating good spaces for kids with this housing. But what's the relationship to the street?
Yeah, so the thing about the mapping is that you've got to see it as a kind of system of places. Sometimes I think about it like kind of stepping stones. So it might be something as simple, and there's an example in the book where I think they could have improved on the layout, where it might be something as simple as a park surrounded by courtyard blocks. But that park has been ringed by a road, and nobody's thought about where the crossing points are in terms of relationships between the courtyard blocks. So if the courtyards are the entrances to the block, which is great, they're kind of activated, then that connection needs to be made through to the park, and you need to be able to think about the movement of a child as safely as possible, with the good sight lines and raised tables, if that's the right phrase that you're familiar with. But sometimes those thoughts haven't been had, and someone's just thought, well, I need to get the cars around, because a big challenge, I think, is in the UK, we're kind of moving, certainly when we're near sort of transport nodes, towards kind of much, much low car parking ratios. But we're now beset by not only the bin lorries, as we call them, the waste trucks and their routes, but also the delivery vehicles, the kind of constant Amazon, Uber delivery vehicles that completely kind of mess up your whole child-friendly plan immediately. So I think that we're being kind of hit by challenges all the time, aren't we? But it's thinking through that route of the child, I think, and bringing the street and the connecting points into that.
Can you talk a little bit more about community and how, in the case studies, because you were going and talking to a lot of people, the presence of children in Marmalade Lane, for example, the presence of children is this thing that is very, it seems to kind of create community. It seems to kind of, like the children themselves are this piece of the whole puzzle that end up bringing people together in a way. I wonder, from the friend of yours who lives in Marmalade Lane, how do they think about community? How do they think about the house and what it does to support their community? What is it about the physical design of the architecture that really supports that community and those kinds of exchanges?
Yeah, so if you ask anybody who kind of lives in a development, and then there's probably people in this room that has some kind of shared space, sorry, I feel like I'm facing away from the audience, that has some kind of shared space that they are quite close to or are using, then they will talk about their community in a really different way to somebody who lives on a main road or a street. And they'll tend to kind of be able to explain how that space that is near them is used right throughout the year and is used in Marmalade Lane. It's co-housing, so it's intentional housing. It's an intentional community, so they come together as a community, and sometimes that can get quite intense. And so I think that's the kind of one end of a spectrum of like very, very communal living, where they can start sharing electric bikes, cargo bikes. They can start. They've got a shop there where they can start sort of sharing equipment and resources and stuff, and helping each other do things. And that space, I think, really helps them to do that. But I think, like, whilst they're quite evangelical about that way of living, I think not everybody wants to live in a kind of intentional community. But actually, the simplicity of that layout. When we went to Chicago, actually for a different project last summer, that same Homes Around a Courtyard space was fostering exactly the same level of support amongst the mums that we spoke to. It meant that they were able to help each other out. They were able to sort of look out for each other, look out for each other's kids. And when we talked to another community in Ireland, they recognised when they didn't have that need, that they didn't have that opportunity. And one mum explained how she had lived in a courtyard scenario, and she realised that she could go to the shops and leave her kid with another parent, and the others were like enviously imagining that scenario. And it was just something as simple as that, that relationship when you've got small kids, and how important that was, but was lacking in their lives. So I think the sense of the word community is strong in most residential developments, in most housing, but the way in which the space is more naturally supporting communities really does differ.
A question from the development side of this story. Mm-hmm. Is it, if you design a housing development that works well for children and families, is that something that developers find to be, at first, do they understand that? Do they find it to be an added value? Do they seek it out already at this point? Because I understand that your case studies are also looking at buildings that are from the 70s, 80s, like, yeah. It's been around for a while. Yeah. But yeah, do they see it as, and are they already seeking out architects who are good at this?
Well, I can answer in the positive and also the negative. I think developers really want to design family-friendly housing because that's a massive part of their market. So whenever you say family-friendly, they're like, yeah, we'll do that, because they've got the customer base, and they're losing those customers actually because they're turned off the kind of high-density living automatically, and they're not quite sure kind of how to bring them back in, because they know that there are like a big chunk of people that and the city government needs them back in the city. So yeah, there's an absolute market for it. But an interesting story in the UK was when, actually, I don't know about in the Czech Republic and Central Europe, but if you walk past a development site in the UK, you'll either see a picture of someone drinking a glass of wine, absolutely no backdrop, no context, just lifestyle, right? Or quite often you'll see pictures of kids playing out. It's like, it's something about it kind of taps into this sense of like, it's going to be okay if the kids are okay, right? And actually, a woman that I now know very well emailed me a number of years ago and said, I've bought this amazing flat on my development, but my kids are being told off, they can't play out, and I've come across your work giving evidence in the Greater London Authority, and I feel like you might know a bit more about this. And I was like, you are an example of what the problem is. And one of the major national newspapers picked up on the story, and it went absolutely viral, because what was happening was we also picked up on the fact that the children from the social housing block were being prevented from using the rest of the development. And it became overnight story with the leader of the opposition tweeting about it and the housing minister tweeting about it. And it overturned policy at a London level. People were disgusted that children's play was being segregated. And so there's something in all of us that you can't speak to any developer now who would support segregated play. It's not always that easy to argue in the moment against things like ball games and stuff, but there's a move towards recognizing, when we remind ourselves about our own childhoods, that these are really important things. So yes, there's a big need and there's a big market, but there's also the challenge of the kind of people moaning about it. And what happens, and what happened to that developer who was absolutely shamed because they had provided segregated play, or they created segregated play. It's not good PR.
Does anybody in the audience have a question now?
I've lulled you into...
We have one here that I'll read. All the solutions presented somehow magically start with disappearing cars. How do we make them disappear in places where underground garages are not possible?
Okay. I brought this over because can I go back, or have you taken it off the presentation? Is that possible? Can you put it back on? Thank you. The disappearing cars, you're right, there's quite a lot of disappearing cars, underground disappearing cars. This one is included. But the case studies here are interesting because the two on either side, the one that we did in Buckinghamshire, in the UK and England, on the left, and then Portloop on the right, they all have 2 car parking spaces per home, so they're not that low. We just did a clever thing on our scheme where we put them at the bottom of the site here, and also we tucked them in here, little car ports here. And then at Portloop, which I think is quite clever, really it's quite simple here. Urban Splash, who are a sort of well-known award-winning developer in the UK, these were just private gardens on the first few phases, and they thought, well, we're going to test something out, and we're going to see what happens if we open up the garden for everyone to share. And it worked. It sold loads of homes. These are all for private sale. And these have got 2 car parking spaces per home. So what we're trying to do, actually, if you look in the book, is make the space more efficient. So the more shared space, the more green space, and the less vehicular space, the better. So we are, as much as possible, but within what we're thrown at us as architects, we're trying to obviously reduce the car parking, but sometimes outside the city centres, we're forced into the 2. It gets really hard when it's higher than 2, but we're forced into 2, yeah.
Does anybody in the audience actually work on the design of housing at the moment? And do children or the needs of kids come into your conversations in the office? Does it come as a question from the developer, for example, or from clients? Does the subject come up?
No, definitely not. Just 2 things what I'm thinking about during your discussion. The one is like the context is totally different in Europe, you know. I a little bit know the East London part, the community Hackney, neighborhood Hackney, and I think it's different. Like the measurements of the streets are totally different in London. We have like more traffic, more like bigger streets, so on. But from the developer perspective, or even like what I met with, they don't really like flats on the first floor, and I think it's really crucial sometimes.
Is the first floor the floor what we would call the
ground floor?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have like other facilities or empty space on the first floor, it's like I think it's a different context. So my question is, how you can work with it?
So your question is, what are the different ground floor
No, if you don't put
uses?
some commercial play.
Yeah, quite often. I mean, these are the kind of lower density schemes, but when you get into the city, I mean, this is the Hygiene Play is full of commercial use on the ground floor. This scheme, not so much, but there's half maybe sometimes. But the problem we also have is what we call ancillary space. I don't know what you know, the bins and the bikes, the waste and the bikes and the plant can take up quite a lot of the space on the ground floor. So we end up really trying to kind of, you know, create the active frontage, but also balance, like you say, the whether we have a kind of whole range of different types, where you might get the maisonette or the ground, or just a maisonette is a 2-floor duplex arrangement. So you might get a duplex arrangement on the ground at the first and second in your language, or you might get maybe a wheelchair unit, which is a flat on the first floor. So I think you know, that we have all the different types. We have, you know, we have everything. And we also have busy roads. Just luckily you can't see any of these.
But maybe other thing is like also in Czech Republic and Hungary and Slovakia, the developers selling 100% of the flat. Basically, they sell the whole building, so they do not have these social flats or affordable living and so on, like in London, in some way included in this block.
Yeah.
So I think it's also one of the problem, maybe.
A London problem or a London condition?
No, in our case, I mean in Europe, in Slovakia or in Czech Republic.
I think that the social housing, private housing mix, so this block here, for example, what we do have sometimes is a complete mix within the block. You might, what we would call pepper pot. So there might be social housing and private housing in the same block, but mostly the blocks are separate, but that you can never tell the difference between the two. And actually the sizes are the same. So in effect, from an architectural perspective, it's blind. Like when you're designing it as an architect, the social housing, private housing is not relevant, if that makes sense. It's the way that the developer decides to split it according to what the government is requiring and what they're deciding they can do from a financial point of view.
But I think it's different in terms of they need to take care of it. They cannot sell it in 100%. I mean, like in our cases, the developers used to sell every flat, every space. So I mean, the maintenance is maybe the key.
Yeah, maintenance is a really big issue, but basically the service charge, that you pay if you are the owner of the flat. Quite often, some of these blocks, this is not an example, but will be built by the developer and then sometimes held by the developer, or sometimes sold. Sometimes they have a management company. So there's lots of different types, but essentially the kind of one shouldn't lead to a different design, if that makes sense. The only slightly complicated element to it, I think, is who's looking after those spaces. So if it's like one organisation or one company looking after it from a social housing perspective, then that might be a different entrance or a different block. And then there is issues around the costs of maintaining shared spaces, absolutely. and rising costs. But I think actually is a real issue. You're absolutely right. But I think from an architectural perspective, and the fact that people, whether they're living in social housing or not social housing, are still going to have kids, that actually the relationship between the shared space and the private spaces is inherently similar. We're having the same conversations. Doesn't matter, you know. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think my question was a little bit different, but yeah, I understand.
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm saying.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is the book, as a kind of like spatial kind of configuration, is useful whichever situation you're in, if that makes sense. But the situation is definitely different, and the kind of drivers behind it and the finance behind it is. I mean, we're having a problem in the UK at the moment because we haven't got enough government grant to build the affordable housing, and the cost of building the homes is so great now that the developers can't sell them. So we've got a lot of schemes that aren't being built out. So that's an economic problem, and now an architect's problem.
Go ahead, and then I'll read another one from the
I think
Slido.
that kind of renders the question irrelevant because I think what we are getting at is how exactly do you convince the developer to maintain the public space and then increase the service fees on top of your mortgage if they can just sell the flats for cheaper and not do any of this?
Okay, so do you mean convincing a developer that there should be some shared communal space rather than everything is sold and privately to each unit? Okay, well that is in the policy, in the government guidelines, is that you must provide some shared space. So it can't all be private. Because I guess, I'm not quite sure if, because basically, and it's definitely true in other countries on the continent, if you're in the upper floors and you just have a balcony, you'll have absolutely no outside space, right? And the people on the ground floor, the first floor, have their outside space. You can't do that in the UK. You have to have some outside space. So it's kind of become policy. It's become policy, yeah.
Thank you.
Lobby your part.
Okay, I'm going to read. We have a very provocative question here.
Okay.
And then if anybody else would like to ask one after. Okay, so they ask, a kid around between 5 and 15 years old is only that age for like 10% of their life. Should we really design the city for a kid?
Oh, okay, so we're doing percentages. Do you want some percentages? Okay. 35% of the population is either a kid or their primary caregiver. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And in the UK, 85% of a child's life is not spent, waking life, is not spent at school. I just put those two statistics together, and that feels like a lot of space and time is needed in the neighborhood by those people. So I've just answered the question by giving you...
Let me jump in too. Let me come in with a statistic. The one that I love also is that 85% of the brain development that we'll ever have in our entire lives happens by age 3. And so we really do need to think about the built environment that does not cause harm to us during those years. But I would also answer this question from a little bit more of a kind of like population scale public health perspective, which is to say that you might not be always a kid, but somebody else always is. And so, no, we are not designing for you, the individual, because yes, you will come into another phase of your life, and you might not need those things anymore, but guess what? Somebody else, a part of your community perhaps, part of your city, will be in your shoes, and we need to design the thing for them. However, and I would also, I mean, I like this question because I think it's something that we think about a lot, I think, in the child-friendly planning field, because for exactly that, which is that you know, we think about design often as something which is very much part of our identity. We think about, imagine designing a great couch. Like, I'm going to like that couch for a long time. That's going to belong to me. That thing has been designed for me, and I will always have it. a child-friendly design approach is something that, for example, with housing, also you're only a parent for a short amount of time.
Oh my God, it goes
And-
on for years. What are you talking about?
With-
You're like,
with-
I've been a
with-
parent for 25
Oh my
years and
God.
I've still
Okay,
got kids.
Okay, but you're only a parent dealing with a particular kind of life form for a kind of short period of time, and then they evolve into some other
Yeah.
kind of life form. But and those needs do change, and I think that this is where we get into the intergenerational housing question, which is that you know, as you start to age, your needs change again, and that community that is present in intergenerational housing specifically is specifically there to help you into your older years as well, and to kind of build in all of those social interactions that we know are very important, et cetera. And yeah, so I think again there's a really interesting question about how design is received by us and at what period in our lives, and how does it work for us. And it's true that we exist in a realm of design that is, we interact with it in different ways in different periods in our life. But still those principles are there that do need to serve people who are in vulnerable stages.
Yeah, and back to the personal, you know, starting with a picture of my son. My parents turned 80 recently, and they decided quite wisely that it was time to move out of their big house with 3 floors and move to a flat. And I convinced them to move to a kind of purpose-built flat, which is what they wanted to do, but on the Olympic Park site in London, where basically we won the Olympics on the back of this idea that we were going to regenerate a whole series of neighborhoods across a piece of industrial land. And as I walked around with them, I said, look, I'm going to be honest, right? This development, which I know really well, has been designed very much with children in mind, but we're a little bit siloed with old people, and we kind of think about them moving into sort of later living, we call it. But actually, can you see how you can use space here, how easy it is to move around, how many places there are to stop and sit, how friendly it is, and you don't have to have a coffee if you want to sit out here, but you can if you want, and how generous the spaces are, and how much you're going to enjoy living here if you choose to live here. And my dad and my mum just were like, you've sold it.
Yeah.
And they've moved into a flat, and they look over a school and a canal, and they can just see life in front of them all the time, and they come to the lift, and the neighbors say hi, and they've lived in a house like their whole lives, and suddenly they've got neighbors. My mum's got a neighbor to help her when my dad goes into hospital, and it's child friendly, and it's age friendly, and it just works. And I mean, I knew that because I could tell them spatially, and I could tell them all the stories and all the stuff behind it. But they could see it.
Yeah.
And they were I took them on a sunny day, but you know, they're so happy. They're so happy. So yeah, I really believe it. Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else with question here?
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question. Most of your examples, which were mentioned, were a fairly new housing or fairly new development, where of course it's much more flexible to work with the public space and green areas. But what we can do with the old development and the old housing, which most of the cities consist of, is there the only option to work with the streets, as was mentioned in the beginning, or are there other concepts how to create more green shared spaces?
So are you picturing kind of 1960s, that kind of?
You're picturing
a
a street in
concrete-
Prague, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, set in the middle, in the historic part of.
Could be in the historic center or just the concrete blocks of housing, which are maybe not that well connected.
So they're quite different, aren't they, from a kind of typological perspective? Because the concrete blocks have got some spaces in between already, right? But the street, the tight historic centre of Prague is quite kind of road, and not lacking in kind of courtyard hinterlands, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think very much depends on the part of the city that some
Okay.
have this internal gardens and connected spaces,
Okay,
but not
okay.
all of them.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for clarifying that. I mean, they're quite, so there are some examples that I've just zipped through that are existing estates where we're looking at infill blocks. And I think that the great thing about starting with chatting to children about how they're using space is that they'll kind of like unfold the space in front of you, and they'll tell you how they move around, and they'll kind of answer all your questions as you walk around with them, and they tell you what works and what doesn't work. And then I think what we then start to do is think, well, this is where you need to put the infill, because this is the space that isn't working, and then the mapping helps you kind of clarify that. I think the good thing about the mapping is it's the start of a conversation. It's not like we've got the answer, we've worked out the system, just stand aside and we're going to put the blocks where we think we know best. But it's about kind of that conversation around how people use space and how there is I think, and I keep repeating, there is a system behind it. I think when it comes to predominantly streets, maybe in the more historic areas or the older, it's about closing roads to cars, isn't it? And finding those spots where, and you've got loads of good examples of that. School streets, the threshold outside the school, it turns out is a really valuable and important part of the city, right? That we haven't understood, actually. It's like you come out of school, you disperse, you go home. What happens if you can pause?
Well, we had this conversation last year here at camp. We had the mayor of Bratislava on stage with us, and we were talking about interventions in streets. And Prague is very difficult to do these kinds of interventions, and this is a challenge that I think is quite frustrating, as I understand it. And there's just a very rigid city that we live in here. I will say that, just as a kind of my version of an answer to your question, is that first of all, kids get a lot of interaction and play at school, and it's kind of okay. And if there are other kids around that they can play with in the afternoons, that might be even in the hallway, it might be at a playground or park. I think there's a decent amount of the world where there's not really a great option for retrofit. And that is, what that translates to is a slightly greater burden on the parent to bring the kid to activities. I think that's kind of what happens. And if you're growing up in the middle of Prague, you're probably kind of okay socioeconomically. You're probably, a lot of the bigger challenges to your eventual thriving are probably not there. So it's not a very good answer, but I think in a lot of the world, there are opportunities for retrofit, and that's where we need to seize on them. There's a lot of greenfield development. Dinah mentioned 1.5 million homes slated for construction in the UK. The EU faces a huge shortage of affordable housing. This moment, the European Commission just appointed a new commissioner for affordable housing and energy for the very first time. The reason that we're focusing on housing this year with Start With Children is that in many places, there are opportunities to address housing. In some places, I think there might just not be as good of options. What we don't want is families to move to the suburbs as an answer. I think we need city centers and urban cores to work for families. But again, there's some policy stuff there at play. I mean, if developers in Czech Republic don't love the ground floor for housing, maybe that can turn into a space through policy. Maybe policy can step in and say every building needs a kind of cooperative, kind of a community space on the ground floor, like it used to be. So I think there's policy solutions. I think in this case, probably developers aren't going to solve, the private market's not going to solve the question itself.
Newsflash.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello. I have a question related to Prague development and panel block housing. I live in the area called Hurka. Maybe some of you know. There are a lot of panel block houses together. They kind of create a sheltered area And in between these houses, there are schools, kindergartens, some playgrounds, athletic areas, swimming pool, other stuff within like 5 to 10 minutes to walk between the spaces, and there are almost no cars. And I do not have kids, I have dogs, and I see it with a little different perspective, because when there are kids, there is a lot of challenges which the parents need to overcome, and one of the challenges is the kid needs to use the restroom. And you have like 2 minutes to sort it out, and even if you can see your window in the block of flat, you kind of can't get there on time. How do you deal with this issue in your development? Because the current situation right now it's very disgusting. I'm sorry, but my dogs kind of prefer to eat human poop. And I know where they are located, and they are very close to the kids' ground, and it's usually the child doing it, so.
Okay. That is the first time I've
Thank you
ever
for
been
sharing.
asked that question. I don't think that's a design problem. I mean, yeah, that's interesting. Has anyone else come across this problem? I mean, I'm not saying it's not happening.
I mean, I guess the issue there would be that the area that's like in between the housing in Hurka is like, I don't know, 400, 600 meters wide, and there's like blocks of towers surrounding it. So I guess it's just like a vaster park than like a backyard.
I mean, adding public restrooms is one of the fundamental features of a child-friendly city. I mean, quick promo for the summit this year. Eva Kale, who was a planner in the city of Vienna, who created a set of guidelines for gender mainstreaming. All of the Vienna developments and public spaces had to go through this sort of very strict set of design guidelines aimed at the needs of women and caregivers. And essentially, restrooms every so often, like very frequently, is one of those things. So that's one thing. So come hear Eva talk about that and why she did it. But another thing is also just proximity to home, and it's exactly what I was talking about in Tirana, which is that that mother didn't want to take the kids very far from home because she'd be far from a bathroom. And so she stayed home, you know. The parents that you're talking about have found a different solution, which is, I don't know, maybe it's a good ecosystem of the dogs eating the...
I mean, maybe what it touches on is how we look after our shared spaces. And I think if you're lucky enough, like me, to have kind of got around Europe recently and been to Bratislava. I mean, just you've seen in the book quite a range of different countries. I think it is cultural how we've kind of taught ourselves to take care of those shared spaces. I was really touched in Bratislava, and I haven't been to the suburbs of Prague yet. I've just got here. How much people spend time and effort on those spaces that in the UK we would call kind of non-defensible spaces, right? Like they're not owned by anybody, but there's people tending and planting, and there's flowers in ways that in the UK people just wouldn't touch. It would just be kind of left to sort of, maybe you've had dog. I've never seen children's poo, but I can't distinguish between the two. But dog poo, and you know. So I think it's really about how much we can care for those shared spaces, and that's a constant challenge for local government and building owners, isn't it? But I don't think it's a reason, and I'm not saying you're suggesting this, to get rid of these spaces, because what I think the throwing the baby out with the bathwater phrase that we use in the UK, like, stop, because how are the kids using these spaces? They might be using them a whole load, but you just haven't noticed. And certainly if the urban planners come marching through and going, well, we can put a block here and a block there, they might be putting them in the wrong place because they think they're solving the problem of the kind of poor maintenance through development. And I think that's kind of blinkered view when you don't think about children. But I your problem is a real problem, and I hear you.
Yeah, the biggest difference between dog poop and kid poop is that the kid one is covered with leaves, like on the top.
Okay.
But I think in some other discussion, maybe a year ago, there was they addressed a topic when this area between the block of flats it's too wide that it's very difficult to maintain it for the general like city people to maintain and clean everything all the time. So
Yeah.
it's usually under care. So that's and when the area is already under care, people are adding the trash in the
Yeah.
place.
Yeah, I certainly feel that in the UK we've gone through this kind of wave of we were talking about this earlier today, the kind of intensification of the city in favour of we've got too much space, it's not being looked after. But I think there's a limit to how much you can cram in before that space becomes so kind of contested and actually what happens, I think, is it drives most people, kids particularly, indoors because they can't use that space because they're being told off, or they can't use that space because there's no space for them to play in it. And actually what then what happens is we don't get the outcomes we want, which is like allowing them outside and not doing the things that you're talking about. But yeah.
Any last question, and then we'll wrap up.
My question is, hi, thanks for a presentation. My question is didn't you ever cross with the problem of residents that they want to have a peace in the courtyard?
All the time.
And they want the kids playing somewhere else?
Yeah. Go on, answer that one, Jennifer. You're going to need a microphone.
It's the place where Dinah's referring to, where my kids basically grew up on. WhatsApp solved a lot of problems and caused a lot of problems. So we have a WhatsApp group. I mean, my kids are too old now to be on it, called Where is My Child? And it's essentially to find out where is my child and are they being okay? Because there's so many different families on the estate that we can work out. And lots of the neighbours joined the group as well and said, you know, they're okay and we spotted them, or your child is kicking a ball against the side of my house and I want them to stop kicking the ball, or your child is on the roof of the shed again. So it's just learning to understand and work with other people and say, we're a big community. I'm not saying it's perfect. There are arguments and sometimes people don't speak to each other for 6 months. But it is a way, it's communication, giving people time and space when they need it, but also understanding that children do have a role to play in society. And a lot of the older people who live on the estate will often say, it's so nice to hear their voices, it's so nice to see them, they say hello to me, I say hello to them, it makes me feel young. So it does work. It's not without its problems, but it does work with that communication. And the noise issue is definitely there, and I don't have a magic solution, but we agree a set of rules sometimes. The teenagers aren't brilliant, and Dinah and I speak from painful experience on that. The teenagers break the rules, and then nobody speaks to the teenagers.
My teenager doesn't even live there and he breaks the rules.
He still breaks the rules. So yeah, it's tricky. I'm not going to pretend it's tricky, but it's keeping that communication going and realising that everybody has that right to live in peace and quiet, but also children do have a right to be noisy and play and run around and be silly. So it's a combination of approaches. But WhatsApp is very helpful.
Perfect
Okay,
answer.
great. Thank you so much, Dinah, for being here. Thank you all for being here and for the questions, and we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Turn my mic.